Hello and welcome back to Under One Roof. I'm Dr Tom Simcock, your host. For those new to the podcast, Under One Roof explores the connections between our housing and our health, from how our pets can make a house a home to how the conditions of properties affect our health. As part of our Festival of Social Sciences Special Edition season, today we're delving into a topic of profound importance, the housing experiences of refugees. Migration has been prominent in global discussions, and we're here to explore the complex housing challenges faced by those seeking safety and sanctuary. In this episode, we'll be talking to Dr Santokh Gill, a senior lecturer at the University of Huddersfield. We'll be examining the challenges faced and the potential solutions and support that can help transform lives. So let's embark on this journey and explore this crucial topic. Santokh, great to have you here with us today. Would you be able to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us about your background and your work?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me on today. It's great to be a part of this. So just to introduce myself, I'm a sociologist, as you've mentioned, University of Huddersfield. Now, for over about 20 years now, I've focused my work very much on issues around race, migration, and ethnicity, particularly in the British context. And that's been the focus of my teaching and my research over that period of time. And over that period of time, I've done a number of projects that have looked at a number of concerns around issues of migration, around issues of cohesion and integration, looking at faith groups, looking at young people, looking at different communities in different locations, as well as looking at organisations that work with community groups to make people's lives better. Currently, I'm a part of a research project looking at the housing experiences of refugees, particularly focusing on Yorkshire and Humber, but not exclusively on that. And we've been looking at those experiences of housing over the last 30 years, like I say, from those different groups, either those that have come through the asylum route or that have come through other government initiatives and projects out there.
Thank you, Santokh. And just delving deeper into the connection with housing in your work, what sort of has motivated for you to get involved in this area?
Well, I'm passionate about this issue. I'm from a minority community myself. My father was a migrant to England, and those issues of discrimination, of integration, of belonging have been a feature of my life as well. And that idea of belonging is really important when we start thinking about housing. And it's central to the experiences of refugees, because housing in very much, and when we're talking about housing, we're not just talking about a home, we're talking about a community, we're talking about a neighborhood, we're talking about an area, links in with a whole range of different things. It links with being a part and connecting to a community. It links with issues around integration. And it links in with those different groups. We're living in a multicultural society, those different groups coming together. So it's the key thing is about integration. That's what makes Britain rich. That's what makes us special, that multiculturalism. And housing and homes are central to that, because we don't want to be living in areas that isolate people. You want to be able to have those opportunities to mix, to learn from each other. So in terms of community, that's really important, that in terms of where you live, the way in which you can, and then it's where you live also ties in with things like where you can get a job. It ties in with employment. It ties in with the opportunities available in those areas. And this has always historically had a link with migrant communities who have often lived in areas that are deprived as well. Housing then also links in with, and your home links in with your health and well-being, and that's centrally important also. If you are, connected to community, connected to house, and you have that, positive home environment, it has a positive effect as well on your health and well-being. And then the housing also, that it's all to tie to those other things like education, opportunities, and when we look at issues of race, of ethnicity, and migration that I've focused on, opportunities and having them there are centrally important. And hence housing is one of those key cornerstones for gaining and having opportunities, for making and having a wholesome life, and being able to give something to society as well.
Thank you, Santokh. And I think, what you're saying there is really interesting. And I think, around that housing as a foundation for opportunity, I think that's a core thread through what you were discussing there. And, as I think a lot of our listeners will be aware, migration has featured heavily in the news quite recently and is quite a divisive topic as well.
Yeah.
Would you be able to provide a brief introduction to our listeners to some of those key concepts and debates?
Yeah, of course. And again, it goes back to those issues I talked about. I'm a sociologist, and I'm also a member of a minority ethnic community, and that means that I'm a part of this process where of communities that have come to Britain because of our colonial relationship. And we're also part of these communities that have, since particularly the post-war period, been seen as a problem. We're over here because you were over there. That's something that's really important to remember. There is a relationship why migration happens. But the decisiveness and the way in which the debates and discussion of migration is problematic, because it problematizes communities that come here. They are seen as a problem, and this is often racialized. And when I talk about race, I don't mean just here about pigmentation, because sometimes it's about or skin color. It can also be about clothing, about other forms of cultural difference that become picked out and being seen as a threat. So what we start seeing is that migration becomes an issue that migrant communities become othered. And this is the way in which they are seen as those that don't belong, those that might be a threat to the harmony of a community for whatever reason, rather than all the positives we bring from that kind of bringing people together, bringing ideas and cultures and practices and beliefs together. Rather than that, it's seen as a problem, and that has been going on from the post-war period, and it means that often us as communities, as individuals, become dehumanized. And one of the things with the rhetoric out there, particularly the narrative around refugees and the words being used, language is really, really important here, because what we see is the way in which language becomes politicized, and it starts creating divisions in society and in communities, and that's something that's really them. If we just think about the Brexit vote, the language used in that led to a spike in hate crimes. It impacted on communities. It had a real effect. And that's been going on since the post-war period. And refugees currently are that group that are targeted in that. And and the language means that people then start creating these kind of boundaries of them and us. Rather than seen as all a part of humanity, we become the other ones that are going to threat our culture, impact, take our jobs away. And that's the other thing. It's when there is economic problems, economic bust, we have less resources. There's a entrenchment of the state, less services out there. But rather than kind of investing in state intervention on stuff, people begin to blame those that are new, those that are different. And that's another aspect of othering here. And they become scapegoats. And migrants are those that after in society are scapegoated, because they are at the lower end of the social ladder, and they become the targets then. And then that means, but they're living in areas and environments where there is already deprivation. And that scarceness of resources means people that start saying the narratives becomes about taking our jobs, taking our homes, which is extremely problematic because there's a whole range of economic and policy led initiatives that have led to the lack of resources there, not the group that have come in to try to improve their lives or escape persecution. So, language is centrally important there, and we really need to do something to kind of stop the othering, stop the dehumanization there, and kind of really kind of think critically of where that's going and how that's leaving those that are often most vulnerable in society.
I mean, that's sort of very, I think, important points that you've raised there around, the language used and the different social and political choices that are made. And I think one of the things that we want to discuss is around some of those policy choices that can affect the housing experiences of refugees. Especially, I think, in your work, you identify a core issue being the 28-day move on as a sort of a key housing challenge. Would you be able to explain, I mean, firstly, what the 28-day move on is and what the challenges are surrounding this?
Yeah, sure, Tom. I mean, one of those issues, and it goes on from what I've talked about before around issues about language and expression, is that we often talk about and think about those people seeking asylum as almost not being genuine. Yeah. And then there is a whole kind of range of kind of procedures that go on before those people that are asylum seekers become refugees. And the majority of the cases, we find that those that are seeking asylum, that have to make their claim for seeking asylum, are seen as having legitimate reasons to gain that leave to remain in Britain. That's really important. And once that happens, they have 28 days from moving on there from the asylum accommodation where they have support to moving into independent accommodation. This then leads to, this is a very short period of time. Now we're talking about this 28-day period where they've got to, from the time they get their biometric permits to say that they, which allows them to kind of claim universal credit, that allows them to kind of gain particularly housing from that point. And it's a very short period of time, particularly when there is already a very competitive housing market out there. And what we find is that they literally have to turn up at their local authorities and say and declare themselves as homeless. And that what that's leading to is a number of families of individuals that are having to move into temporary accommodation because there just isn't the social housing available, or the possibly private rented housing available at that time. So they have to go into these emergency accommodations, temporary emergency accommodations, and it could be hotels, it could be hostels, it could be in a number of different places, and that then puts those people that are already vulnerable, that might not know the system, very often the system not very well, may not have very good grasp of English, literally having to negotiate this whole process. And they may have, a family with young children, or they may have needs in terms of disabilities. But because they have to move into, because they are homeless, they have to move into temporary accommodation. It puts already vulnerable people in more vulnerable situation until a more appropriate form of housing is made available. And this can take quite a period of time. So again, it can prolong the whole process of people waiting. They've already been through a whole process of waiting to see if they can stay, then having a positive decision, and then having to wait until they can start those things I talked about earlier on of connecting, of belonging, of integrating, of finding a job. So it prolongs that whole period. And like I said, if they've got young children, it then means sorting out where they go to school. It then means sorting out how they can kind of have care provisions in place. And it's a very difficult period of time. And our research has found a number of people talking about that period of time being a real nightmare. It was hard enough going through the process before, but then that whole nightmare began. People actually describe it as a nightmare. That's where they kind of, were moving from property to property, or accommodation to accommodation, or they had the worst. They were staying with young children where there were people with substance misuse right there, or in areas where there was antisocial behaviour, which made it very difficult indeed.
And as you were just discussing, that sort of nightmare situation of the 20-day move on, you touched on universal credit and in particular around the issues around welfare reform as well. I'm thinking of how have these issues around welfare reform and universal credit affected the housing journeys of refugees?
Well, what we're finding is that there's a shortage, and the essence of it is there's a shortage of good quality, affordable housing. That's the essence of it, which makes it all difficult. And there is, in terms of the universal credit, there's only a certain amount that people can get in terms of the housing aspect of it to pay for rent. The difficulty is the amount of good quality properties that are available in that are quite scarce. So there is, I mentioned the scarceness of resources before. That is one of those areas. But the problem is that people are finding themselves then in poor quality housing because of the amount they can afford that's made available with universal credit. And then it leads you into the hands of, market systems, really, because landlords, letting agents, they want the best kind of price they can do for the houses that they've got. They want as much as they can. Not all, but there's some that do. And in that context, that we're just finding that universal credit isn't enough. And then it isn't also something that landlords that they themselves want. So we often find one of the things we find is almost a form of discrimination and stigma attached to those people on universal credit, where landlords and letting agents will just not want to give rent their properties to those people on there. Those that have recently received refugee status are at that end. So they haven't been allowed to work, so they're looking for employment. They are having to depend on welfare. And having to do that, they then are again in that bracket of people that renters don't necessarily want to rent to. They're not the ones that people are desired. And this is also in a landscape, in a period of political context where what we talk about as being the hostile environment. And this was a kind of level of initiatives and policies that went out to kind of made it that was supposed to make it an unwelcoming space for those that migrated illegally, but it's impacting on many migrant groups. It's impacting disproportionately on ethnic minorities, and in particular, one of the key elements of that is the right to rent, and this is where a person has to prove that they have a right to rent and they've got proved that they've got right to live in the UK. And this makes it quite difficult because landlords ask for that. So already there's issues about universal credit and how much money they get to pay for rent. Then they've also got to have prove that they have a right to live. And they do have a right to live in the UK, but it kind of creates a bit of a kind of concern with landlords and letting agents. And then we find that there's then a form of discrimination that's taking place where people are sort of saying, well, have you got a British passport? and they may not have a British passport because they've got a right to. I mean, I didn't have a British passport for a long time. Not everybody has a British passport, but it makes them nervous, and people then may discriminate, and that is the impact, and that is a part of those kind of hostile environment initiatives and policy that's driven by that initiative that has made it difficult for those with refugee status, but also other minority ethnic groups as well, to get suitable rental properties out there.
Thanks, I'm talking. I think that's, as you're saying, a core point, and you're saying about universal credit as, that element of stigma, and then with private landlords, but then there's also that, as you're saying, what's I think in past been called a no DSS, clauses or provisions in advertising, but then there's also the right to rent, which adds that additional layer of, issues that can affect landlords and letting agents judgment into whether to rent to that person or not. And one of your core themes through, this discussion as well, but your work has been on the lack of affordable housing, specifically social housing. This has meant a greater reliance on the private rented sector, not just for refugees, but individuals across society. How has this sort of reliance on the private rented sector affected the housing experiences of refugees?
In our research, it's been pretty evident in terms of those that many of the difficulties in terms of the barriers to opportunities that refugees have experienced have been because of the having to rely on a range of different factors, and one of those, having a range of different factors play against them. One of those is having to have sometimes rent, poor quality housing. There's been ongoing, in terms of the people we spoke to, they talked about, that, the overcrowding in rooms, the issues around damp and things around ventilation. It's the poor quality of housing itself. The other thing has been in terms of the location of the housing. Sometimes it can be areas that are already deprived. Like we've mentioned, that issue of no DSS, that's something that they really, many of them talked about, that they could not believe that people could actually have that written down on something or say that and do that. So it kind of has been a barrier in for people to kind of get that fresh start, because getting status was meant to be a fresh start. So housing and having to rely on private rented sector, which and the lower end of the private rented sector has inhibited the opportunities for refugees to kind of get onto the ladder, of social mobility. And when I use the word refugees, it's really important not to homogenize that, because that is a diverse group of individuals with different skills, language skills, qualifications, experiences, that nations, faiths, is and they belong to a range of different communities. So and that also is important, and part of it is sometimes it's those things that can also work against them. So they all work positively if they are moving to an area where there's others from a Muslim community living there. It could be quite positive for them, but and it can help the integration. But that has also been a factor that's played a role in kind of inhibiting opportunities again.
Thank you, Santokh. And I think if we move on and look forward and think about what could be done, what do you believe could be done on a broader scale to affect meaningful change for these different groups of refugees?
There's a number of things that can happen, and some of it's if I go back to language, it is about changing the narrative. Let's think about that. If there wasn't such a polarization by politicians or media to kind of create a level of hostility, that would really help. As migration brings great opportunities. It brings with it such positives to communities, to society in terms of art, sciences, literature. There's a lot of positives that come out of migration and out of integration. So just change that narrative to focus on the positives, be a start. That'd be good. And then I think there's other reforms that are needed. There's in terms of policy, we really need to think about how much universal credit people get in terms of the rental element of it, so that they can actually move into have housing that is of good quality. So there is that kind of element of kind of finding ways in which that, or whether it's in terms of discretion, of just allowing people to have that stepping stone of that good quality property where they can where it's affordable in terms of universal credit. So just that top up that could help to kind of get that financial starting point going. And again, that'll have a real positive. On another level, it's just a real positive would be proving communication and understanding and knowing about rights. So if landlords just had that information, if people could act as maybe guarantors or just give that reassurance that, okay, this person does have the right to live in the UK. Maybe that kind of nervousness by landlords and letting agencies would help support that for those first steps. And that's really important. So, and I think that part of that, again, it can be an easy thing. It can just be some form of communication of people acting as guarantors or just having that reassurance. So I think what could happen is that there could be some mechanism, whether it's in local authorities, where just introduce some form of trust. And I think that would help. And again, in many ways, this is the problem that in reality, what that right to rent was meant to do, which was linked with illegal migration, hasn't really impacted on that group. It's impacted those people that actually have a right to live in Britain. It's impacted on minorities because of discrimination about fears. So we need to, again, these are all tied. That whole idea of hostile environment needs to shift as well, because it's impacting on groups and people, and stopping them making the most out of society as well.
Thank you, Santokh. And I think that's really important around changing the language. I think, and around the changing the narrative around the hostile environment and the impact it has on those different groups. For our listeners who want to learn more about your work and the projects you're involved in, can you share how individuals can get more information?
Yeah, we'd really like you to kind of explore some of the work we've been doing. I mean, we've been involved in an iDoc, we've been involved in a writing of a comic, as well as reports and academic papers. So you can find information about the projects we've been involved in and the outputs from our website.
And you just mentioned, around those more innovative and sort of creative outputs that have been designed to sort of get the word out about the research. You mentioned the iDoc and the comic. Could you explain what these outputs are and why these are particularly important?
Yes, of course, Tom. I mean, one of the things that, as somebody who's worked in academia for around 2 decades now, is that we often find that there are academic papers written, or there are reports that go to practitioners, or they go to an academic audience, and that seems to be it sometimes. What you want to do, and what really needs to do, particularly in issues where we need to shift the narrative, where we need people to trust, the people to kind of really understand what it actually means, what to be a refugee, to understand lived experiences. We thought of creative ways of doing that, one of which was the iDoc, and one of the best ways to really get an insight to people's lived experience is to have them talk. And we can't have people just walking around talking every day. So our documentary iDoc, which is an interactive one which you can access from using a computer, allows you to kind of go into different rooms, different parts of their house, and listen to what they feel and their housing experiences have been, insight into their everyday experiences. It allows us to have an insight into their thoughts and feelings around things like employment, around having families, about and other aspects of their everyday, which we only know if we kind of listen to their stories. And the iDoc allows that. The comic, in a way, allows us to kind of tell a story, tell a typical story of refugees, but do it in a way that's more accessible, that doesn't use the language that reports or academic papers would have, but then means that other people, from people like young people at schools, young people involved in colleges, can also get some insight of those experiences. The comic was based very much on a number of different stories. The characters were, of course, made up, but the stories it tells is based on real experiences of people we spoke to. So again, it's about capturing those voices and allowing a platform for them to be heard.
Thank you, Santokh. And it's really interesting. And I've got a copy of the comic as well here, and it's really, really a fascinating output. And so thank you for being on the podcast. I think we've learned a lot about different concepts and the different issues as well, from the hostile environment to othering to welfare reform, the reliance on the private rented sector. So I think we've covered a huge amount of topics in such a short space of time as well. So thank you for being here as a guest as well.
And thank you, Tom. Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of this episode on the housing experiences of refugees. As we close this episode, I'd like to thank our guest, Dr Santokh Gill. His expertise and passion for this topic have genuinely enriched our understanding. In our next episode, we'll delve into another crucial topic: bereavement, relationships and home. In this episode, we'll be chatting to Dr Julie Ellis, and I'm sure this is going to be a fascinating episode. Don't forget to tune in to our next episode as we continue our exploration of housing challenges and the lifelong well-being of diverse communities. It's all part of our special ed season for the ESRC Festival of Social Sciences. We value your feedback and insights, so please take a moment to complete the short survey provided in the episode description. Your input helps us to shape future discussions and ensures we're addressing topics that matter to you. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to having you back for our next episode. Until then, take care, stay curious, and keep exploring the profound connections between housing and well-being with us on Under One Roof. This publication has been produced with the financial support of the European Union Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. The contents of this publication are the sole responsibility of the University of Huddersfield, and in no way reflect the views of the funder, the European Commission, or the United Kingdom Responsible Authority. Neither the European Commission nor the United Kingdom Responsible Authority is liable for any use that may be made of the information in this publication.